the organizations that do the most meaningful work, they aren't born from strategy, but rather it's this profound calling to do something about something or a gap in the system.
It absolutely is not a school or a nursery saying yes to having complex needs and just having them present, facilitated. It is creating an atmosphere where those children have a chance of success.
They could mean inclusion by having a child with additional needs physically present.
We are facilitating entry for children with really complex needs to classrooms where teachers have not had the training to manage and accommodate those complex needs.
So you've got a child with needs in through your door. You're not inclusive yet. This is just the beginning of the journey, right? Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of What Inclusion Actually Means. When I was working in an early years center, something I struggled with was seeing parents who knew that their children needed supports, who were actually asking for support and advocating for it and doing everything that was right, but yet still hitting wall after wall. And on the other side of that, I also saw educators and centers who genuinely wanted to help, but had no roadmap, no resources, and no one coming in to fill in the gaps. So that experience never left me, and it's exactly why I wanted to have today's conversation. Welcome to the Early Years podcast, brought to you by the Early Years Academy by Paranap, your village for the early years. We're here because everyone at Paranap believes that the adults in the early years ecosystem, so the educators, the leaders, the families, even the children, they deserve the same level of care and investment and belonging that we pour into the children we serve. I'm your host, Danielle Kinney, Head of Pedagogy at Paranap. I'm an early childhood educator, a former center principal, and a master trainer in trauma-informed practice. Our guest today is Dr. Catherine O'Farrell, the co-founder of Inclusion, an organization that has trained over 1,000 learning support assistants across the UAE and is on a mission to ensure that children with special educational needs don't just get enrolled, but that they get supported and access to the same level of care as every other child. We talk about what inclusion actually means in early years, what centers think they're doing versus what's really happening for the child, and of course, the misconceptions that always kind of get in the way of our practice. So let's get into it. Catherine, I'm so glad you're here, and I want to start where most good things start, I guess, with the problem that wouldn't let you go. Because I think the organizations that do the most meaningful work, they aren't born from strategy, but rather it's this profound calling to do something about something or a gap in the system. So what is the story behind inclusion? What were you seeing that made you think this needs to exist?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here. And my two areas of interest are both inclusion and early years, and it's really wonderful to see a podcast like this that's sharing practice widely and freely with the community. Inclusion was born from two pathways in my life. I was a corporate lead for some of the bigger educational groups here in the UAE for a number of years. I had started out as a primary teacher. I moved into psychology when I saw the need for greater understanding of children with diverse needs. And then I was a head of inclusion, a principal, and moved into corporate. And when I was working corporate, I saw more and more this huge gap in terms of provision for children with moderate to profound needs in the mainstream setting. And as the UAE was shifting from the medical to the social model with a much greater influx of children with complex needs into the mainstream setting, we saw a much greater need and dependence on learning support assistants. But the quality of those learning support assistants was neither designed or regulated or mandated. So you had everyone from the household nanny to the cleaner who were acting as a learning support assistant in the school, having really profoundly negative impacts on the children. So rather than actually helping them to access education, they were actually forming another barrier to their education. So I spoke with a long term friend of mine and a lady who had been hugely impressive on me in the inclusion space, Harmeet, my now partner. And at the time, we started talking about the need for supporting this gap in the industry. And we said, right, well, we've got to do something about it. She was a head of inclusion for years, and she had been working one on one with families who had struggled year in, year out to find quality support. So we spoke with our third partner, who is a global businessman and philanthropist, and the three of us came together to form Inclusion. And with his help from a business perspective and a development perspective, our practical knowledge and application, we formed the business that we have today. But the second kind of segue that led me to this was that I had had an accident about 8 years ago where I had broken my spine in five places. I was hit by a car. I broke my eight ribs, my shoulder, my hip, my ankle, and I was in a wheelchair for quite a period of time. And the doctors had told me I wouldn't walk. So I was really facing life as a person of determination. And my time in the wheelchair showed me that the UAE is not accessible. It really is not. It's really, really challenging to move around, to get things done. But you kind of become invisible when you have a disability like that. And I found that when we were out with my mum and my sister moved over here for weeks and weeks to take care of me when I was in my initial stages of rehab. And we would go out and people wouldn't look at me like people in restaurants, in shops. They'd look at my mum and say things like, oh, would the lady like some water? Or would the lady like to order? And I was like, what the heck? I've become invisible. So that also kind of fed into this journey and the path and my passion, what I have now, to try to make the landscape more accessible. So we founded the company 5 years ago as a small little social enterprise. And alhamdulillah, we have grown hugely. We now support over 1,000 families. We have 500 schools in our portfolio through consulting. We support schools to be more inclusive and to work towards improved inspection outcomes, and through the provision of LSAs. And we have over 200 LSAs working with us. And they are absolutely wonderful, predominantly ladies and a few gentlemen.
Yeah.
And yeah, we've really grown, and we've been very lucky in the people who we've worked with, the schools, the heads of inclusion are really our backbone, who are all working really tirelessly in schools to make inclusion better.
And I think that context matters so much, Dr. Catherine, because as you said, like, in education, it's assumed that inclusion is very advanced because of how much awareness there is around early detection and intervention and support and how critical the early years are. But the truth, far from what I've seen, doesn't reveal that. It actually it's the contrary. We have a lot of work to do to not only still raise awareness and kind of go on that uphill battle, but also to raise access as well. And you were saying it wasn't until you were in a wheelchair that you realized a place that is as advanced as the place we're fortunate enough to call home is actually inaccessible. You know, with all its advancements and all of its, the bells and the whistles, the most simple and basic need for belonging and accessibility wasn't there for you.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
what,
very true.
yeah, so what was the landscape for inclusion what was the landscape for inclusion before inclusion started? Like what have you guys since been able to accomplish?
So we've seen huge drive from the government, particularly here in Abu Dhabi, to drive for inclusion at a policy level. which I think, yes, there's a lot to be said for ground up inclusive practices, but ultimately, if you have a policy issued tomorrow by a government body, a ministry, a regulator, it's going to be implemented. So you've got a much greater chance of success when it's coming top down, from my experience. The third sector space here, where we have a huge number of private entities operating to achieve the governmental policies around inclusion, has really, really blossomed. Where 10 years ago, there was very little provision. An example of that would be one of our partners, Topland POD. They provide accessible tech for organizations, for education, for construction, for the beaches. Like all of those, the beach chairs you see, they're all Topland. The sunflower lanyard is distributed here by Topland. Nobody
Yeah.
even knew that this was available 10 years ago.
Right.
There are organizations now like the Butterfly who advocate for inclusive employment.
Yeah.
Again, 10 years ago, there was nowhere you could go if you had a POD as a young adult who was seeking a post. They only had themselves. There was no advocacy. And now the Butterfly has developed this huge inclusive employment ecosystem where they've got organizations like EAND, Fab Bank, Accenture. All of these guys are participating to make their workspaces more inclusive. So, in that way, the landscape has changed completely, where with government backing and with a greater awareness, like you say, organizations like ours are more facilitated to actually operate and have an impact and actually get things done. So the landscape has definitely changed a lot with the backing of government entities like MAAN, the Authority of Social Contribution, and MASRA, the National CSR Fund. They work with all of us guys who we're classified as third sector entities because we're social ventures supporting society. And without them, I don't know if we would have had the capacity to grow the way that we have.
Yeah. Yeah. That's perfect. Dr. Catherine, I think I want to backpedal a little bit because we're talking about inclusion, and I just realized that I don't think we've really defined what inclusion really is. And I think language shapes our practice more than we realize. So a center can call itself inclusive, um, but we could picture something very different. They could mean inclusion by having a child with additional needs physically present at their center. And other times, when it's used, it could mean that a center is genuinely supporting that child, cultivating a sense of belonging for that child, ensuring that they're able to participate and access the learning just like any other child at their center. So, yeah, I wanted to know, what does inclusion really mean to you? How would you define an inclusive center? When you use the word inclusion, what are you picturing?
I believe that inclusion is defined by the success of
Mm.
the people who are within that ecosystem. That inclusion, like you say, it absolutely is not a school or a nursery saying yes to having complex needs and just having them present, facilitated. It is creating an atmosphere where those children have a chance of success. That success may be completely individual. Success for one child might be developing life skills. Success for another child, again, all with complex needs, could be full graduation with a top tier score, facilitated even though they've got complex barriers to learning. So again, I think it is creating an atmosphere where a child has the opportunity to succeed. And that is definitely not sitting in a classroom with an LSA who inhibits their participation and a teacher who doesn't know their needs and doesn't hands over complete support to the LSA. That
Yeah,
is definitely not it. It's got to be much more than that.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's where one of the most important skills we can develop as educators even as leaders, is the ability to audit our own centers honestly, not to defend what we're doing or to find excuses for the way or the circumstances that have made us choose the choices we have, but maybe to ask what you're saying, Dr. Catherine, which is, what is this child's experience of today? Or when you walk, when that child walks in, what are they feeling? Are they feeling a sense of dread or a sense of exclusion right away because of the way that things are set up, or the way that the LSA intervenes constantly, or the language that's being used, around them? So when you walk into an early years setting that calls itself inclusion, for example, is there one thing that you look at and you think, okay, I see this, so this is really working? Or is it, a bunch of different things?
Well, I'll give you an example. In the first inspection I had as a head of inclusion from the KHDA, I was working at a school called Ranches at the time, which is a really, really wonderful little primary school. And when the inspectors came, I had very little experience of leading an inspection. The lead inspector for inclusion asked me, "Oh, can you show me which tier three students we should go look at?" And when she pulled her list out of tier three students, I was looking at the first names and I was saying, "Oh no, not that one, not that one, not that one." She said, "Why not?" And I was like, "Because you can't really tell that they're tier three." And she was like, "But isn't that the best way to see them? That you can't tell that they're integrated." I was like, "Yeah, but we're doing so much more for these ones, and you can see it this way, and you can see this that way." And she said, "No, I want to see the ones who are fully integrated and how you've done that." And that kind of shifted my perspective that it's not about this visible, there's the POD, this is what we're doing for them. It's that you walk into a classroom and you can't tell who is a POD and who is a typically functioning child because they are so well integrated and so well supported that their needs are absorbed.
So when you say POD, you said it's person of determination. Is that right, Dr. Catherine? Okay.
Correct.
And you
Yes.
were saying that when they your tier three is what? Children who are integrated or not integrated?
Ah, let me explain. So
Yeah.
generally, in provision, you will have tiered levels of support for a child whose individual needs. So now they're called tiers, levels, or waves. It depends on which school you're in. Generally, the US curriculum schools will use the term tiers, UK will use levels or waves, but it's up to the school as to which terminology they use.
Yeah.
So level one will be the lowest level of individual support for that child, which would usually mean that maybe the child has a little extra intervention from the teacher. They may have a group learning plan. They may or may not get additional support from the SEND team or the inclusion team. For tier two, the child will have a greater level of support. They may get some pull out sessions, some push in sessions by the inclusion team. They may or may not have an IEP or a group learning plan, but they certainly will be tracked and monitored to ensure that they neither don't regress further, and they may have further intervention to try and progress them down to a tier one. And then there's tier three. Usually, this means they have a formal diagnosis from a centre, an MD, or whichever. They will certainly have an IEP and they will be getting pretty standard intervention from the inclusion team, which usually means one or two pull out sessions a week and one or two push in sessions a week as well. The teacher would be fully aware, they should be tracked and monitored individually, and they
Right.
may or may not have a learning support assistant working with them.
Right. And I used to believe that an individual learning plan was almost vital, not only so that everybody involved in the child's care was looped in, but also so the teacher had something visible, something that would hold her also accountable to the level of support that that child needed. But a lot of pushback that I would get, Dr. Catherine, from educators that I worked with is that, again, it was just another thing for them to document, another piece of paper for them to do. So I guess for the educators sitting or listening who might feel like it is an additional piece of work or a piece of paper that they have to fill out, is there a reframe that you can give them about how important that piece of paper really is?
Absolutely. So the traditional model of the IEP focused on additional academic targets for the child, which, just like you say, it's just another body of work that they have to do.
Yeah.
The more recent and absolutely more impactful model is a barrier focused IEP. And
Mm.
this is an approach that we have a lot of pushback from schools and parents because they always think, oh, we need academic targets, English, math, science, that's what we have to work on. Absolutely not. The purpose of an IEP is that you take a typical child, you take a child with individual needs within a single classroom where the teacher is delivering their maybe or maybe not differentiated instruction, but their instruction. You want both children to be able to learn equally. So the purpose of the IEP is to remove the barriers to learning that a child with individual needs will have. So if let's take, for example, let's say dyslexia. If
Yeah.
we look at the condition of dyslexia, you will have maybe visual and auditory processing needs. If the teacher fully understands that you have a child whose visual processing is, say, distorted by dyslexia, but the use of something like a reading window or colored overlays can complete can partially or completely mitigate against those needs. And by simply using those overlays, you can remove that barrier to learning so that what child one typically functioning reads is very similar to what child two with dyslexia can read because you've given them the tools they need to access the learning in the same way. So an IEP shouldn't be, I have to do more instruction, I have to do this and that. It should be focusing on what is the barrier, how can I accommodate for that in my teaching, whether it's by providing a wobble cushion, maybe giving movement breaks, ensuring that the child is seated preferentially closely to you or further away, as some cases may be, or you're using something like colored overlays, maybe ear defenders for children who have sensitivity. Like gives the teachers a toolbox that they can use to help that child access so that they don't have to differentiate their instruction a third level, a fourth level, a fifth level. Um, that by providing those tools, you're creating accessibility for the student without having to change what you do, essentially, in an ideal world. That's what it should be. So it's making your life way easier if it's done correctly.
Absolutely. I love that reframe and to focus on the barriers as opposed to the gap in the learning for the child. I mean, that in itself is so empowering. So when you're sitting there and you're writing, let's say 4 to 5 ILPs, for your class, and you're constantly pointing out the deficits, it can get really discouraging for an educator to keep going. But with what you're saying is we identify the barriers of learning and we're writing like a cheat sheet almost to how we get
Exactly.
past that.
Exactly.
We're, yeah, it's almost as if it's our roadmap. And when it is used like that, why wouldn't we follow it, or why wouldn't we want to transcribe that into
And
documentation?
this is something that my partner Harmeet and I are so passionate about because we've seen how successful it can be in literally hundreds of schools. And if you shift that focus from the child has to learn X, Y, Z to why aren't they learning X, Y, Z? What's stopping them? And then creating the pathway for them through that. And we have designed, at Inclusion, we've designed a one-page IEP for teachers. Now, inclusion teams go crazy with us when we present this, but we have supported schools in reaching outstanding in inspection using this one-page IEP that we've designed. And it has been, if you think of your life as a teacher, like you have a million demands on your time. You've got to do your assessments, you've got to do your tracking, you've got to do profiles, you've got to keep parents happy, you've got to keep your head of section happy, you've got to do your lesson plans, you've got to do all of these things. Inclusion is
Yeah.
yet another thing that we ask teachers to do in their daily schedule. If you can reduce the paperwork, the workload, the amount of time it takes them to access what you want to tell them about that child, all the better. So if you hand a teacher a 5, 6, sometimes 10 and 15-page IEP, which I have seen in many schools, I've inspected dozens and dozens of schools, and you're looking at a 15-page IEP. Who's going to read that? I know if I'm teaching a lesson, there's no way I'm going to pause my instruction, take something out, and flip through 15 pages to see if I can help Ahmed pay attention more. No way. But if you've got a one page and maybe you've got it stuck on your wall or you've got it on the front of your lesson plan, you can immediately see accommodations that work. Maybe they need a reading window, maybe they need a wobble cushion, maybe they just need to be nominated additional times to ensure that they're engaged. But you'll see it right there in front of you, and it's accessible. So it's all about accessibility for the teachers and for the children.
Yeah. Accessible and actionable as well. That's what I hear. Like if I don't know what to do inside the class and I have this child with additional needs and I'm looking up there at my board, it's telling me exactly what to do with that child, as opposed to again telling me what that child cannot do, which I already know because it's already giving me trouble inside the class.
Yeah.
Dr. Catherine, there's also another fear that I used to hear a lot from practitioners, and it was that if they did have an ILP for a child and they were focusing or giving this child a little bit more focus, then the rest of the group and the class suffers and their attention is finite, right? And if one child gets more of it, then the other child gets less, or the other children in the class get less. And I've heard this from experienced educators, even from directors or people who, genuinely were trying to do right by every child in their care, but then I could sense they still had this fear. So where does it come from, and what do you say to it?
I would say that this is a 100% legitimate concern.
Yeah,
And it does stem from teachers who are perhaps not trained, not informed, not supported in how to manage or how to accommodate complex needs. I sometimes use the analogy of, like, imagine if you are, like, I grew up in a little village in Ireland, and I'm bringing my, say, Ford Fiesta to my garage every week for regular maintenance. And my mechanic in the village is no problem. He can handle all of that. Then one week I bring him a Ferrari, and he's never had training. He's never seen it before. And he flips the lid and he's like, oh, I don't know what to do with this. I have an idea, but I don't know. It's similar when you've got a child with really complex needs. You need to be trained. You need to have support. You need to fully understand what they are. And we cannot expect every mainstream teacher to suddenly be an expert in autism, in dyslexia, dysgraphia, whichever need that the children may have. And with the real swift changes that we've seen in legislation in this region, in the UAE particularly,
yeah,
we are facilitating entry for children with really complex needs to classrooms where teachers have not had the training to
yeah,
manage and accommodate those complex needs. So, yes, it does happen. It does happen that they eat up the teacher's time because they don't understand how to implement an effective IEP. They may not even have an IEP that supports the child's access to learning. So, it is legitimate. And the way that we need to tackle that is to first ensure, before you admit a child, that your teachers have the capacity to accommodate them. It's not about saying yes, it's about ensuring they can be supported. It's about ensuring that you don't have four or five really complex cases in one classroom where one or two, any teacher can accommodate one or two with the right training. If
yeah,
we have complex needs, they do need additional support. They do need time and attention. So that fear is legitimate. And that's where the leadership and management really need to appraise the school's capacity realistically and see where are the gaps for teachers in their learning. How can we support teachers? But ensuring that your inclusion team are adequately resourced with both manpower, with people, and with the capacity to write truly meaningful IEPs that aren't just learning 100 CVC words or counting to 10. Those barriers are 20 years ago. They should not be on an IEP anymore. Or sorry, those targets. So my answer is that yes, it's legitimate, but it's focusing on how to support teachers in being realistic in their ability to to facilitate students is it's kind of a
Yeah.
management responsibility rather than a teacher responsibility.
Right. And I think what you just said, and you put your hand on the pain points, like right on, which is what teachers feel is that their centers or their schools want to be inclusive. And so in being inclusive, they've opened up the gates to any and every single child out there. And as you said, any teacher, any even a junior teacher would be able to support a child with needs, given that there aren't 5 or 6 cases just like that child in her class or in his class. And the onus of that does lie on the administrators and the center principals to, again, evaluate how many children, what are their needs, where are we going to put them. Yeah. And on that thought, I wanted to talk about something else. So a lot of centers, they rely on enrollment and enrolling children with needs because, again, when they have a child with a need enrolled in their center, enrollment is countable, right? It's visible. It's something that you can report. So when you get a child with an additional need enrolled in your center, you get to say that you're inclusive or that you're accommodating. But again, as you've said, that's just the beginning, right? It's not the end of inclusion. So you've got a child with needs in through your door. You're not inclusive yet. This is just the beginning of the journey, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And if I was a parent looking at a center to allocate my child to, one of the first questions I would ask is, could I see some sample IEPs? Redacted, of course, anonymous, but could I see some samples? You can tell a heck of a lot from IEPs and how they're written. Are they child focused? Are they focusing on the barriers? Do they have the voice of the parent, the voice of the child where appropriate? And it can be appropriate as low as KG. Like I often meet heads of inclusion. How can I have a KG child contribute to their IEP? Ask them what they like and incorporate it into their IEP. Easy peasy. Um, it's not a complex process. But from a teacher's perspective, if you're looking to join a school, then I would speak to teachers who are there already. If you can, try and find some parents and speak to them and
Yeah.
ask them what's the landscape like, what's the workload like, what's the training and support that they get from the team like. And you can really gauge, is it truly inclusive or is it bums on seats? Because you see often, especially with new schools, the pressure on leadership is so high to get your numbers up very quickly that they often will admit students whose needs feasibly cannot be supported within that setting. And you end up then within a couple of years that some of those children are squeezed out or parents withdraw the children because they realize the support is not there. And that's no good for anyone. So it's better to be conservative if you can, withstand that pressure for enrollment and be realistic and realistically appraise your teacher's capacity.
Right.
Um, and work if you can be realistic. But as we know, there are pressures, especially in the private sector where you've got KPIs to meet.
Yeah. I know as a principal, one of the most common asked questions that I got from parents with children with needs was, well, what's your inclusion policy? And as great as a question that sounds, deep down inside, I'm like, this is not going to give you what you really need to know. Because I can tell you we're 100% inclusive. We don't deny any child admission based on any condition. And I could say all that because it's written in our policies. But I think deep down, what sometimes I say to parents, I think you want to know what I'm going to do for your child or what we do as a center for your child or how we make sure that your child can succeed in our center or could get or can access the learning in our center. And like you said, reframing that or asking centers, can I see a sample ILP, an individual
Yeah,
learning plan, or teachers when they walk into a school, let's say for an interview, again, is to ask about that because that's going to tell them what the center or the school believes or does for children with additional needs. And that will tell them more about the inclusion than an inclusion policy.
But we shouldn't really say that we admit everyone. We shouldn't say that we don't deny anyone based on an individual need. It's much
Yeah,
better that a school understands their capacity and that we
yeah,
say, actually, we know what we can accommodate, we know what we
yeah,
can't accommodate.
yeah,
Like, um, and it's okay for a school to say that. Obviously, we've got our regulatory policies that are pushing for more inclusion,
yeah,
but any inspection, any inspection I've ever been on, if a school honestly says we believed that we could not accommodate these complex needs and we refused entry, we've set our case out with ADEC or KHDA or SPIA, um, we've actually appraised them much more positively because if it's unless you're being exclusive, which there is still a lot of that does happen, but
yeah,
if you can see reasonable doubt or reasonable accommodation for those who are present, and you know that okay, this school is being fairer to a parent because it's better to say no than to have them sitting
yeah,
passively for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, which really is
absolutely.
still happening.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that I had to unlearn, Dr. Catherine, which is that, again, you, as a center, you cannot be for every single child. You cannot accommodate every single child. Just as anything has limitations, you yourself or your center or you as educators also have limitations. And being honest, again, about those limitations um, will help ensure that you do right by every single child that you have in your class. Because you're right, we can't accommodate, 6, 7 children with needs inside of our class. Our
Yeah.
class is going to suffer. So that's something I had to unlearn, and it was rather difficult. Is there anything that you had to unlearn, Dr. Catherine? Is there something you believed early in your career that then was challenged? So I think one of the most honest things we can model for anyone listening is, evolving our thinking isn't a sign that we are wrong. It's actually that we're paying attention and we're willing to learn and grow.
Um, there are many, many, many things that I had to unlearn in my career, and I'm still unlearning and learning lots of things. Um, but I think one of the key things that I had to unlearn was when I became a head of inclusion, I was in a nice small little primary school, and we had a lot of autonomy as an SLT as to how we could devise policy and disseminate requests. And by requests, I mean demands on the teachers. So we would literally, I could go to the teachers on a Monday and say, I need you to implement this X, Y, Z by Thursday. And we were kind of allowed to do that. And when I moved to corporate and I was managing 12 campuses in my first corporate role, I thought I could lead with the same kind of, okay, I'm going to roll this out on a Monday. I want it done in 2 weeks' time and expect it to be done. And I realized that I became really hyper aware of the workload that teachers have. Even though I had been a teacher, I was an early years teacher for years and I was a primary teacher for years, and I knew the pressures of those roles here in the UAE. And I think I kind of forgot about them when I went into leadership in schools. And then I came to corporate and I realized these guys have got 20 tasks to do today, and mine is one more that I'm adding on top of that. And to put unrealistic time frames, and I say this to heads of inclusion now all the time when I'm working with schools, that you've got to be very mindful of the whole landscape for the teacher, speaking to the assessment coordinators, speaking to the VPs, the subject leads, like what are the demands on their time this week? Do they have lesson plans due? Do they have reports due? Do they have assessments due? There's no point in asking teachers to fill in IEPs if they've got 6 other priorities before you. They won't do it, and you end up getting frustrated.
Yeah,
So it's important that your whole SLT sit together and plan out the calendars so that you don't overwhelm teachers with 10 tasks that have deadlines all in the same week or the same month, even, and
Right.
set those out, spread them out as much as possible. So to be mindful of the workload for everybody's sake. So you don't have to chase somebody 20 times
Yeah.
and they don't have to be reminded 20 times and feel that stress of so many jobs to do.
Right. Right. And sometimes resistance isn't always opposition. I had to sit with that as a leader. I think sometimes my educators were fearful of getting it wrong, of not having enough, or not doing the ILPs correctly. Sometimes it was just exhaustion, as you said, Dr. Catherine, the thousand things going on. Sometimes it was me asking them to do more with less. So a lot of things goes behind resistance. In your experience, who pushes back the hardest on inclusion, and what do you think is underneath that?
This is situation specific. Depending on which emirate you're in, it's
Yeah,
either going to be parents,
yeah,
leadership, or teachers. I've found that in Abu Dhabi, we still have a lot of resistance from parents. They are fearful, they are stigmatized still, and they are very reluctant to commit to support for a need that may not have been formally identified. In the Northern Emirates, I see pushback from teachers predominantly. They neither identify or commit to support in a lot of cases, and you
yeah,
see that in the differences in identification across the regulators. Like Dubai, we're probably sitting at 8-9% of students are identified, whereas Abu Dhabi it's about 8%, and in the Northern Emirates that's still sitting around 2 to 3%. It's pretty low.
yeah,
So that identification is not really coming from the educator side. So it
yeah.
differs according to which where you are, which emirate, and the landscape around.
Around that. I think we're lucky that we work in a region, Dr. Catherine, where there is actual genuine government commitment to inclusion. We know that the mandates exist, the framework is there, and I think generally the intention from educators and centers is really positive. But then at the same time, I feel like there are gaps. So if a center, let's say, identifies that it's at capacity and that it can't really accommodate any more children with needs, and we said that that's okay, right? But then there'll still be parents out there who are trying to find, centers or schools to accommodate their children, and they're feeling like no matter where they go, they're not being accommodated or included. And I feel like how do we hold both those truths at the same time without also losing faith in what the government is doing to mandate inclusion and to raise awareness?
Yeah. So there's a commonly held perception or perhaps a misconception that a school cannot deny entry. Now, you are encouraged to accept wherever possible, but if a school can genuinely show that they are not in a position to accommodate a complex need, the regulator will support that. And I've seen this many, many times. The team at ADEC are, and KHDA, SPIA, RACDOC, they are hugely supportive of schools. Yes, they support parents for sure, but if you are genuine in your presentation to show that you can't accommodate someone, nobody can force you as a school, as an organization, as a provider. Nobody can force you to accommodate a student, especially if you believe that there is a risk for the student. Um, for parents, if they believe that there is an unjust or an unfair refusal, which there often is. And you can see that simply by walking into a schoolyard or taking a tour of the school and seeing in the classrooms. If you don't see any complexity of need, then you know that the school is probably being exclusive. But there's also a caveat there. Would you want your child in a school that is being exclusive? So it's kind of a catch-22 because as a parent, you want to go to a school where they are accommodating, but not just saying yes for the sake of saying yes. So you do want to see some variety of needs when you walk around, but not to the point that they're being excluded or isolated or highlighted, but where they're part of the whole system of this ecosystem of the school, where they are engaged with other kids, participating in class. Um, and like it really is a catch-22.
Yeah,
We have very few options for parents when it comes to highly complex needs here. And there's definitely a need to service that gap for sure. Um, and I think we kind of have a fear of saying children do need specialist provision because it seems like it's exclusive, but sometimes that is the right option for children who have highly complex needs.
right.
Um, if you've got profound autism, which is becoming more and more common, a child
Yeah,
does not want to be in a mainstream classroom. And as a counselor, a psychotherapist, I've worked with young adults with autism, and they've described their experience in mainstream settings, and it has been absolute torture for them. And you hear that from an adult's perspective. And I look back on my own career and I think, gosh, how many kids did I force into mainstream? How many kids did I push
yeah,
parents? No, no, they have to be in mainstream settings. And then you hear it from the child themselves as they're more able to express it. And you think, oh, crikey, I wish I'd known then what I know now.
right. Right. And then at the other end of that spectrum is also this misconception where any child with additional needs has to be in, a special needs school or a special needs class. And I find that there's a lot of educators as well who are contesting that and saying no, not every child with additional needs has to be segregated and put in a classroom with other children who have needs as well, and we can include them. So again, I see both ends. As with anything, you are going to get that.
Yeah.
But Dr.
There's
Catherine,
no doubt that for the majority of children with individual needs, the mainstream setting is better. There's no question about that. The research is categorical, there's no question. One of the main reasons being that when they graduate from school, they're going to be in a society that is mainstream. So they have to be prepared and I suppose kind of inculcated for that. But then for the minority, there is a preference for special settings, specialist settings for those. Yeah,
and I think holding both those truths is really important, and knowing when one ought to be chosen over the other is really valuable. So yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that forward. Dr. Catherine, before we wrapped up, I do want to pick your brain on, one actionable takeaway advice that you would give to, let's say, yourself at the very beginning of your career as an educator, or to the educators listening right now. What would it be in terms of inclusion and how to be, let's say, more inclusive in their practice?
um, I think teacher training and
Yeah,
implementing a one-page IEP.
yeah,
And I know three things. One thing that I would certainly wish I had been more cognizant of as a head of inclusion and a principal is that paperwork is hardly ever read by anybody. So
yeah,
you are spending hours and
yes,
hours every week writing and writing and writing
yeah,
documents and documents and documents that
yeah,
you are probably wasting your time. And I'll never forget my first inspection. Um, like as a head of inclusion, I had spent hours and hours curating this huge folder full of all the evidence, every little detail of everything we were doing. When you are on an inspection, you have maybe an hour to review your documentation across the week because you're so busy. You've got your interviews, your class visits, you've got like when somebody hands you this big folder, I remember thinking, what the heck? What's in here? I can't look through all of that. And it broke my heart because I knew the hours and hours of work that went into it. So
Yeah.
if you are a SEND teacher or a head of inclusion listening to this, I would say look at every document you create
Yeah.
and think, who's going to read it?
Yeah.
What impact is it going to have on the child? Would your time be better spent either with the child or creating really wonderful lessons or support for the child? Because if you're writing a 20-minute review of a lesson that you gave, much better to write a 2-minute review and spend an extra 20 minutes with the child. Much better.
Yeah. I remember a brilliant educator I worked with and very early on in my career, and I showed her an ILP that I had spent so long putting together and researching all the things that I could do with this child to get them to close as many gaps as possible. Oh my goodness, I can't tell you how long it was. And she said to me, you know, she read it and she's like, that looks great, but like, what are you going to do with the child? Like, show me, what are you going to do with them? And I think that really opened my eyes in terms of like, yes, you can prepare the best possible document, but again, what matters is your interaction with that child. And that's why, Dr. Catherine, I love what you said about, you know, having the barriers written down on that piece of paper and you putting it up in your class. And again, you can take away all the identifiers, you know, and just leave it up there as inspiration, where when you're stuck with this child inside your classroom and you're not sure what to do, you're looking up at this document that tells you exactly what you can do to remove the barriers that again inhibit this child from accessing the same things everyone else does. And I love that, and I wish that I had heard you say that in the very beginning of my career, because I think I would have been able to reach so many more children.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I think for sure in the UAE, particularly with inspections, with pressure from owners, pressure from leaders, the idea that you have to create all of these documents to track everything, the idea is often only held by the practitioners. Very
Yeah,
often the principals will say, don't do it because they've done it. And they realize when they get to principalship that nobody reads most of this stuff. So, like,
yeah,
just take a step back. Whatever documentation you're doing, ask yourself for every item that you do, who's going to read it?
yeah.
Because if you can't answer that question immediately, that document probably isn't valuable.
Right. Catherine, I wanted to say thank you genuinely. This is the kind of conversation I think that this podcast was built to have. Your honesty, your openness, and you know the inspiration that you've given us actually gives us something that we can take back into the classroom with us tomorrow. And I hope everyone listening leaves with at least one thing that they're going to do differently, or see differently, or ask differently. Everything you guys need to know about Catherine and inclusion will be included in the show notes. And if this episode landed for you, please share it, pass it on to a colleague, a director, a parent, or a friend. I think this conversation deserves a wider room. So, Dr. Catherine, thank you so much for your time.
And thank you very much for having me. It's been a really nice chat. It's lovely to talk with somebody who understands inclusion and who's truly curious as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catherine. And on behalf of everyone at the Early Years podcast and the Early Years Academy by Parent App and Parent App, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.